Just a very quick one, beautiful community, about this question of whether the Russian regime minds becoming what's cartoonishly called a vassal state of China in the years to come. And I think one thing that we've got to keep in mind is all of that mission stuff that we connected with Putin's psychological evolution or devolution in power from about 2012 onwards, which enormously exploited this Russian sense of being somehow deeply wounded, as though they'd done what was asked of them at the end of the Cold War, given up their colonies, given up much of their power, but they were meant to be welcomed into something in response, receive something in response. They feel that they didn't. And that kind of resentment was then layered over by the teacherly tone with which the West approached the business of modernization in Russia in the 90s. And Putin set about exploiting that over years and years and years in power. So that culminated in this bizarre ultimatum to the West at the end of 2021 and the brutal invasion of Ukraine. So you see how deeply embedded this project of existential escalation against the West is. This project of undermining whatever there is of Western global hegemony, undermining this business of the West doing what it wants while singing siren songs about democracy, and transcending this sense of being rejected by the West. The West is something that the Russians wanted to be part of, and then they couldn't. And that feels like a kind of wound. And none of that is true with China. Russia finds China rather alien compared to the West, because for all of the anti-Western sentiment in Russia, it is anti-Western sentiment from the position of a kind of almost laughable normative dependence on the West. So none of that historical trauma, none of that resentment, none of that toxic legacy of unhealthy political sentiment is there with China. So I think that's a very, very important decision. In other words, Russia can think about its relation with China much more pragmatically than it's able to think about its relationship with the West. And what is absolutely clear now, and we've attacked this from different angles, including the point about the education system in Russia, how young Russian kids are being sort of psychologically built up with some kind of a massive confrontation with the West in years to come, that the Putin regime is now all in on this course of a big escalation against the West. So it can't really pragmatically recalculate the situation and say, okay, on balance, it's not worth it. And that would really be the only way that Russia could avoid becoming now increasingly a junior economic partner of China, increasingly economically dependent on China, and then that leading on to increasing political dependence, the kind of political dependence we haven't seen yet, but that could easily evolve in the years to come, where China dictated Russia's foreign affairs to a good extent. The only way Russia gets out of that is if it stops this escalatory challenge against the West. But with that, Putin and his regime are all in. You're not going to see that stop unless that regime collapses. And it's not just that China's the only direction in which Russia can go if it is to continue this existential escalation against the West. It's also that there may be some thought about backing China with a view to increasing China's chances of beating the West, strengthening China's position vis-a-vis the United States by getting on board with China as a kind of indirect way of realizing Russia's mission of this existential challenge against the West. So this is something that in the Kremlin they're not going to like, they're not going to want, but it's going to be an essential byproduct of them going all in with this business of war, and not just war with Ukraine, but a conflict against all of the West. And it was interesting in their public speeches what Xi and Putin came up with about the global order was a bit different, because she said, look, we've got to focus on whatever fluffy language he used, justice and equality on the global scene, but we've got to make sure that that's compatible with development and prosperity at home. And when Putin made his statement, there was just no pragmatic economics there at all. He just said, we've got to achieve the realization of the principles of the international order that we believe in, that move us toward a multipolar world. There's no qualification there. That's quite an interesting difference between their statements. So that's a little bit of the sort of psychological sentiment around what will be much better analyzed by others, which is Russia's increasing economic and eventually, I believe, political dependence on the West, that once structured in, is going to outlast the Putin regime. Lots of love and talk soon.